Have you ever wondered how close you've come to danger without even realizing it? At Shivering Vault, we take you there, one story at a time. But before you drift off, consider liking this video and commenting where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into these chilling stories. It was me, my girlfriend Sarah, and our two friends, Kyle and Jess. We had been planning this weekend getaway for weeks. All of us had been stressed out with work, and the idea of disconnecting from everything sounded perfect. Sarah found this cabin on some rental site, and it looked cozy in the photos. Nothing fancy, just a small wooden cabin in a quiet area outside Weed, California. When we arrived, it was late afternoon, and the first thing I noticed was how secluded it was. The nearest house was probably a mile away, and the driveway leading up to the cabin was surrounded by thick woods. It felt like we were in the middle of nowhere, which was exactly what we wanted. The cabin itself was small but nice enough. It had 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with a big window that looked out onto the woods. There was even a little fire pit outside, which we thought we'd use later. The owner had left us a note with the key, saying they hoped we enjoyed our stay and to call if we needed anything. Pretty standard. We unpacked, had some beers, and just relaxed for the first couple of hours. Everything felt normal, even peaceful. Jess joked about how we were in a horror movie setting, but none of us took it seriously. We were just excited to have a chill weekend. The weird stuff started that night. We were sitting by the fire pit, roasting marshmallows and talking about random stuff, when Kyle suddenly froze mid-sentence. He was staring into the woods behind us, his face pale. "What's up?" I asked. "Thought I saw someone," he said, squinting into the darkness. We all turned to look, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. "You're imagining things," Sarah said, laughing nervously. But Kyle wasn't laughing. He kept staring for a while, then shrugged it off. We all went back to talking, but the mood had shifted. I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder every now and then, just to make sure we were alone. When we went back inside later that night, Sarah locked the door and double-checked all the windows, which was a little out of character for her. She said it was just because we were in an unfamiliar place, but I could tell she was spooked by what Kyle said. Around midnight, we all went to bed. Kyle and Jess took one room, and Sarah and I took the other. The cabin was silent, except for the occasional creak of the wooden floors, which I figured was normal for an old place like this. I must have fallen asleep pretty quickly, but I woke up a couple of hours later to the sound of footsteps outside. At first, I thought it was an animal. We were in the woods, after all. But then I realized the steps were too heavy. It sounded like a person walking around. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. The steps moved slowly around the cabin, pausing every so often. I reached over and shook Sarah awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She listened for a moment, then nodded, her eyes wide. Got out of bed as quietly as I could and peeked out the window. It was pitch dark, but I thought I saw movement. A shadow passing by the side of the cabin. I grabbed my phone and texted Kyle, "You awake?" A few seconds later, he replied, "Yeah. Someone's outside." We all ended up in the living room, whispering and trying to figure out what to do. Kyle wanted to go outside and check, but Jess and Sarah were against it. We decided to just stay inside and wait it out. Whoever it was would probably leave once they realized we weren't coming out. But they didn't leave. We heard the footsteps circling the cabin again and again. Then they stopped by the front door. There was a long silence, and then a soft knock. None of us moved. The knock came again, louder this time. "Who is it?" Kyle finally called out, his voice shaky. No answer. Then we heard scratching. It sounded like nails dragging across the wooden door. Sarah was almost in tears, and Jess was clutching a kitchen knife. I felt completely helpless. We had no weapons, no way to defend ourselves if this person decided to break in. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. We sat there in silence, too scared to move, until the first light of dawn came through the windows. We thought it was over, but we were wrong. That night, it got worse. We decided to stay another night because, honestly, none of us wanted to drive in the dark after what happened. We figured it was probably just some local messing with us, and we'd be fine as long as we stayed inside. Everything was quiet until around 2 a.m. That's when we heard the window shatter. It was the one in the living room. Glass flew everywhere, and before we could react, a man climbed through. He was wearing dirty clothes and had this wild look in his eyes. He didn't say a word, just lunged at us. Kyle tried to fight him off while Sarah and Jess screamed. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, which was a heavy lamp, and swung it at the guy's head. He stumbled back, but it barely slowed him down. We managed to push him out the door and lock it, but he kept pounding on it, screaming that he was going to kill us. We called 911, and it felt like an eternity before the cops showed up. By the time they got there, the guy was gone. The police searched the area, but didn't find him. They said it was probably some drifter or someone on drugs. They didn't seem too concerned, which pissed me off. We packed up and left the next morning. None of us could sleep that night, and we didn't feel safe staying there another second. It's been a few weeks now, and I still can't shake the feeling that he's out there somewhere, waiting. I don't think I'll ever feel safe in the woods again. My college friends and I rented an RV for a trip to Joshua Tree. There were 6 of us. Me, my girlfriend Lila, my best friend Nate, his brother Jake, and our friends Amanda and Eric. We'd been talking about a weekend getaway for months, and Joshua Tree seemed perfect. None of us had been before, but we were excited about the idea of hiking, stargazing, and just chilling in the desert for a few days. We all needed a break from school and work, so this felt like the perfect way to relax. We rented the RV from a guy in San Bernardino. He was super nice, but he looked a little strange, like someone who spent too much time alone in the desert. He gave us the keys and reminded us to keep the RV locked at all times and avoid certain areas in Joshua Tree, though he didn't say why. He just warned us. Some places out there have bad energy. Trust me, you'll feel it when you're there. We all laughed it off. It sounded like something out of a horror movie, but we were excited and eager to get going. We drove out Friday afternoon, and it was a few hours before we reached the park. We picked a spot not far from the park entrance, which was a little quieter than the main campgrounds, but still had a few RVs and tents around. It felt safe enough, and after the drive we were all ready to relax. The first night was perfect. The stars in Joshua Tree are unlike anything I've seen. We cooked burgers on a grill, cracked open some beers, and spent hours just talking. It was the kind of night where you don't think about anything but the moment. But as the night wore on, I started to feel a little strange, like something was off. I didn't say anything at first, because I figured it was just the desert heat or maybe a little too much beer. Around midnight, we were all sitting outside around the fire, talking and laughing, when something caught my attention. I thought I saw a figure moving in the shadows by the rocks. I blinked and it was gone. I didn't say anything, but I felt uneasy. When I looked at the others, they didn't seem to notice, so I figured I was imagining things. Around 2 a.m., we decided to call it a night. We went inside the RV and locked everything up. I remember feeling the strange sensation again, like someone was watching us, but I told myself it was just the desert. After a while, I fell asleep. The next day, things started getting weird. We woke up early to go hiking. We picked a trail that wasn't too difficult, but still offered some great views. The hike was beautiful. Joshua Tree is incredible, with the big rock formations and the odd spiky trees all around. But as we walked deeper into the trail, I started to feel a heavy sense of discomfort. It wasn't anything specific, just an overwhelming feeling, like we weren't alone, like eyes were watching us from the rocks. We kept walking, but every time I turned around, I thought I saw someone moving just outside the trail. I'd blink, and nothing would be there. We made it back to the RV early in the afternoon and immediately noticed something was off. The door was cracked open. I know for a fact we had locked it when we left, but it was definitely open now, just a tiny bit, enough that it shouldn't have happened on its own. Maybe it was the wind, Jake said, trying to sound reassuring, but it didn't feel like the wind. It felt like someone had been inside, or worse, was still inside. We went in together, checked everything, but nothing was missing. It was just wrong. Like someone had gone through our stuff but hadn't taken anything. The unease in my stomach grew. Lila noticed it too. She kept glancing over her shoulder like she expected someone to be standing behind her. I tried to brush it off, but the feeling wouldn't go away. That night, we decided to stay inside. We made dinner, ate, and played cards. As soon as the sun went down, the air seemed to change. It wasn't just the temperature. It felt like the world had gone quiet. All the sounds of the desert, the birds, the rustling of the wind in the trees, everything seemed to stop. It felt like the desert itself was holding its breath. Around 10 p.m., we were all inside the RV, hanging out, when we heard voices outside, low, muffled voices. At first, we thought it was just people from other campsites nearby, but the voices were strange, low, and unintelligible, like they were whispering to each other. We stepped outside to see if it was anyone we knew, but the desert was silent. The voices stopped as soon as we stepped out. Eric started laughing nervously. I bet it's just some drunk campers messing around. I didn't believe that. The voices had sounded wrong, like they weren't supposed to be there. When we went back inside, Amanda was freaked out. I saw shadows by the windows when you guys were outside. I swear I did. We all laughed it off, but it didn't feel right. It felt like something was watching us, waiting. We locked all the windows and doors, but none of us slept well that night. At around 3 a.m., I was awoken by a loud bang. I sat up, heart racing, and I heard it again. Like something hit the side of the RV, hard. I woke everyone up, and we all listened, holding our breath. Then there was a knock at the door. Not a regular knock, but a banging knock, like they were in a hurry. A voice called out, "Hey, we need help. We're lost. Please open up." It was a man's voice, rough but with a sense of urgency. I looked out the window. There were 3 people standing outside, 2 men and a woman. They looked strange. Their clothes were dirty, and none of them had any gear, like they had been walking for days without supplies. One of the men was leaning against the RV, looking at us through the window with a piercing stare. Nate stepped forward and said, "Sorry, we can't help you. You should try another campsite." The man didn't say anything for a moment, then knocked again, harder this time. "Open the door. We need to use your phone." Something in his voice made my stomach drop. I whispered to Lila, "Don't open the door. Something's not right." But before we could respond, the woman started banging on the side of the RV, screaming for us to open up. The second man walked around to the back of the RV and started shaking it. They were trying to break in. Eric, who had been standing by the door, shouted, "Leave us alone! We're calling the cops." The man at the door laughed, a low, menacing laugh. "You think the cops are going to help you out here?" We could hear the anger in his voice, and then the other guy started yelling too. It was like they were trying to force us into opening up. They were shaking the RV harder, and I thought for a second they might tip it over. The woman started cursing at us through the window, and that's when we knew this wasn't just some lost hikers. These people were dangerous. We stayed quiet, hoping they'd go away, but they didn't. It was like they were just waiting for us to make a mistake. After what felt like hours, they finally stopped. The banging stopped, and we heard their footsteps retreating into the desert. We stayed inside, not daring to move. We didn't know if they were just waiting for us to slip up or if they'd come back. When the sun came up, we cautiously stepped outside. The RV was a mess. The tires had been slashed, the windows scratched up, and there was spray paint on the side. The words, "You're lucky," were scrawled across the RV in big, sloppy letters. We were all in shock. We packed up as quickly as we could and drove out of there, not even stopping to look back. When we got to the park ranger station and told them what happened, the ranger didn't seem surprised at all. He just nodded and said, "There's a lot of weird people out in those parts. Next time, stay in the more populated areas. You're lucky you're all okay." We didn't stay to hear more. I don't think any of us will ever go back to Joshua Tree or anywhere that isolated again. I had been planning this solo road trip to Death Valley for weeks. After months of work stress and my personal life falling apart, I needed to clear my head. Just me, my camera, and the desert. It seemed like the perfect idea, a weekend getaway to one of the most remote places in California. I wanted solitude, space to think, and some beautiful photos to remind myself there was more to life than the grind. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened out there. The drive out started early on Saturday morning. I left my small apartment in Los Angeles, packed up with snacks, water, and everything I thought I'd need. The city quickly gave way to open roads, mountains in the distance, and a deep blue sky. With my favorite playlists on repeat and the windows down, I felt the weight of everything begin to lift. By the time I reached the outskirts of Death Valley, I was already feeling lighter, like I could finally breathe again. As I drove deeper into the valley, the landscape turned surreal. Wide stretches of cracked earth, towering rock formations, and an endless horizon. The kind of emptiness that makes you feel both insignificant and free. I pulled over a few times to take photos. The light was perfect, a warm glow that made the desert look alive. I hadn't seen another car for miles, but that was part of the appeal. Just me and the wilderness. But as the afternoon wore on, the solitude started to feel heavier. There's something about being completely alone in such an empty place that can play tricks on your mind. I started noticing how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just the hum of my car and my own thoughts. I shook it off, blaming my overactive imagination. After all, this was what I came for. Peace, quiet, and the chance to be alone with my thoughts. Around 4 p.m. I realized I'd ventured pretty far off the main road. I hadn't seen any signs or markers for a while, but my GPS had been guiding me, so I wasn't too worried. I figured I'd head back soon, but then I noticed my gas gauge was lower than I'd thought. I cursed myself for not filling up before heading into such a remote area. My phone had already lost service an hour ago, so I couldn't check for nearby stations. I told myself I'd be fine if I turned around now and drove carefully. That's when my car sputtered and died. At first, I thought maybe I'd stalled it, but no matter what I tried, the engine wouldn't start again. Panic bubbled up as I realized how alone I was. The sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, and the desert's daytime warmth was fading fast. I got out of the car, looked around, and saw nothing but endless desert. No signs of life, no other vehicles, just me and this broken down car in the middle of nowhere. I tried to stay calm. I had water and a flashlight in the car, and I'd passed a couple of other cars earlier in the day. Someone was bound to come by eventually. I sat on the hood of my car, watching the horizon, trying to convince myself this wasn't a big deal. But as the minutes turned into hours, the reality of my situation started to sink in. Just as the last light of the sun disappeared, I saw headlights in the distance. Relief washed over me as the vehicle approached. I stood by my car, waving my arms to signal them to stop. The vehicle slowed down and pulled over. It was an older pickup truck, dusty and battered, like it had seen a lot of miles. A man stepped out, middle-aged, with a weathered face and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "You okay?" he called out, walking toward me. His voice was calm, almost too calm. Something about it made me uneasy, but I pushed the feeling aside. I was desperate for help. "My car broke down," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you have a phone I can use? Or maybe you can help me get to a gas station." He looked at my car, then back at me, his expression unreadable. "No phone," he said, "but I live a few miles up the road. Got a truck there. I can give you a ride." I hesitated. Something about his tone didn't sit right with me, but what choice did I have? I couldn't stay out here all night. "Okay," I said. "Let me grab my stuff." As I turned to open my car door, I caught a glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye. He was reaching into his jacket. When I turned back, I saw the gun. My heart dropped. "Get in the truck," he said, his voice cold and steady. My mind raced, trying to process what was happening. I glanced around, looking for any way out, but there was nowhere to go. Just endless desert. "Please," I said, my voice shaking. "I'll give you whatever you want. Just let me go." He smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. "I said get in the truck. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." I don't know what came over me, but in that moment, adrenaline took over. I turned and ran, bolting into the darkness. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. My legs burned, my chest heaved, but I kept going. The desert was pitch black, the ground uneven, but I didn't dare look back. Eventually, I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands and knees. I stayed down, trying to catch my breath, listening for any sign of him. The only sound was the blood pounding in my ears. I crawled behind a boulder, praying he wouldn't find me. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I couldn't tell. Then I heard it. The faint sound of a car engine. My heart leapt into my throat. Was it him? Or was it someone else? I crept out from my hiding spot and saw headlights approaching in the distance. I waved my arms frantically, tears streaming down my face. The car slowed and stopped. A woman got out, looking concerned. "Are you okay? What happened?" I could barely get the words out. He had a gun. He tried to make me get in his truck." She didn't hesitate. "Get in, now." She drove me to the nearest town, where I was able to call for help. I reported what happened to the local authorities, but I never heard if they found him. The whole experience still haunts me. I've replayed it in my mind 1,000 times, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't run. I thought a solo trip to Death Valley would help me find peace. Instead, it showed me how fragile that peace really is. That's it for today's tale from Shivering Vault. If you have a story worth sharing, drop it in the comments or send it our way. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your fellow thrill seekers. As always, the Shivering Vault thanks you for unlocking today's tale. Until next time, the vault awaits your return.